Everyone around me mistook my silence for weakness. But silence is just the thunder waiting for the sky to split open. I realized that the day my husband, Jonathan Hale, handed me divorce papers in the hospital while I was still holding the child I nearly died to bring into this world. He thought I'd beg him to stay. Instead, I signed with steady hands because the storm was already on its way. My name is Vanessa Morgan Hale, and until that moment, I had believed in a version of love that only existed in fairy tales, one where sacrifices were noticed, loyalty was cherished, and promises meant something. But Jonathan, with his sharp suits and sharper words, had spent years tearing away pieces of me, unnoticed until they became invisible. And now, in the sterile fluorescent light of the hospital room, while I fought blood and sweat to deliver our baby, he was busy delivering the final blow to me in the form of divorce papers. Life and death in the same breath, both delivered with precision. It wasn't just the papers. It was the look on his face, cold and detached, like he had no memory of the woman who had shared every secret, every dream, every hope with him. "It's over, Vanessa," he said, voice clipped, rehearsed, almost clinical. "I've made my decision. There's no turning back." The irony didn't escape me. He spoke of decisions while leaving a life he helped create hanging by a thread. I remember gripping my newborn daughter, Emily, so tightly I thought my fingers would leave impressions on her soft skin. She had been through so much already, born premature and fragile, and here was the man who was supposed to protect us, tearing our family apart in the cruelest way imaginable. Nurses glanced at us, some with pity, others with thinly veiled judgment, but no one intervened. And why would they? They didn't know the years we had invested, the silent compromises I had made for a marriage that now seemed built on illusions. I took a deep breath, tasting iron and antiseptic, feeling a rush of clarity amidst the haze of exhaustion. Jonathan expected tears, pleading, maybe a crumpled signature soaked with desperation, but I gave him neither. I signed the papers, my hand steady, my expression calm. The room was silent except for the faint cry of Emily, and in that quiet, something shifted inside me, a quiet rebellion that spoke louder than any scream he had expected. As Jonathan left, slamming the door with all the smug confidence of a man certain of his victory, I finally allowed myself to let go, not of Emily, not of life, but of the naive hope that he had ever truly loved me. The storm had been brewing for years, and now it was awakening. Weeks before that day, our marriage had already been a battlefield. Jonathan's ambition was relentless. He spoke often of business expansions, meetings, and networking events, but rarely of us, of our home, or the child we were bringing into the world. I remember evenings when I sat alone in our master bedroom, staring at the empty side of the bed he had abandoned to his work, wondering if the man I married even remembered my face anymore. He had chased success so blindly, he forgot the treasure at home. It wasn't always like this. There had been moments, fleeting, almost cinematic, when he seemed to care. I remembered our first apartment in Chicago, tiny but ours, with peeling paint and a balcony we had once claimed as our kingdom. I had laughed when he tried to assemble furniture he had no business attempting, and he had smiled in that infuriatingly perfect way, brushing a strand of hair from my face. Those memories were now tainted by the harshness of reality, shadows of a life that had long since vanished. Love had become a memory, and betrayal its echo. The pregnancy had been another battlefield. I had sacrificed my career, postponing promotions and opportunities, all in the name of supporting him and bringing our child into the world safely. He had offered support sporadically, mostly financial, but emotionally, he was absent. I had learned to navigate fear and exhaustion alone, battling the anxiety of complications, while he continued to chase deals and accolades, blissfully unaware of the life growing inside me. He counted accolades, I counted heartbeats, and only one mattered. And yet, despite all this, I had loved him. Foolishly, stubbornly, with every fiber of my being. Until that morning in the hospital, when the man I had trusted most in the world proved that he was not only indifferent but cruel. Delivering divorce papers while I clutched Emily was not just betrayal. It was theatrical, almost cinematic in its execution, designed to humiliate and assert dominance. Life and divorce intertwined, a cruel duet only he could orchestrate. As I watched his retreating figure, I felt a quiet fire ignite inside me, a fire that would no longer burn in secret. My parents had warned me about his arrogance, about the way he treated women who didn't conform to his expectations. Friends had tried to intervene, offering advice and support I had politely declined, thinking I could weather the storm on my own. But no one could have prepared me for this. And in that moment, I realized that vengeance was not merely an option, it was inevitable. The joke, I realized, was that he had thought I was the punchline. I looked down at Emily, her tiny fists curling instinctively around my fingers, and I made a promise, not just to myself, but to her. I would not allow the man who thought he could erase us to have the satisfaction of our defeat. There would be no shouting, no desperate pleas. Silence would be my weapon, observation my ally, and patience my strategy. He had underestimated me, as he always had, and that would be his downfall. The first nights alone were the hardest. Our home, once filled with the comforting hum of domestic life, felt like a hollow shell. Jonathan's absence was palpable, yet strangely liberating. For the first time in years, I could breathe without fear of judgment, without the weight of expectation pressing down on my chest. I wandered through the rooms, Emily swaddled against me, and noticed things I had overlooked. The meticulous arrangement of his business files, the stack of legal documents left carelessly on the desk, the way our financial ledgers were divided. Little details that spoke volumes about the man who thought he controlled everything. He counted possessions, I counted opportunities. It was during these quiet, sleepless nights that I began to understand the extent of my own agency. Jonathan had left his arrogance as a gift, and I intended to use it wisely. I started keeping notes, organizing files, and quietly researching our assets. What he believed he owned, I discovered, was not entirely his. The house, the business shares, certain investments, there were cracks in his fortress, overlooked by his hubris. And as I pieced it together, the storm within me grew stronger, gathering force like a thunderhead on the horizon. He thought he held the keys. I was learning which doors he had foolishly unlocked. Outside, life carried on oblivious to my turmoil. Friends visited sparingly, offering platitudes and hesitant sympathy. The hospital staff became familiar faces, nodding in acknowledgement as I carried Emily through corridors that had once been the stage for my humiliation. Each day, I grew more resolute. Jonathan had made a critical mistake. He had confused my silence for weakness, my solitude for submission, but I was neither weak nor submissive. I was calculating, patient, and ready. I began to envision the moment when all of this, the deceit, the arrogance, the betrayal, would come crashing down. Not in anger, not in haste, but in the quiet precision of someone who had been underestimated for far too long. The storm I had promised was no longer a metaphor. It was real, gathering energy, waiting for the exact moment to strike. And yet, even as I planned, I allowed myself small moments of tenderness. Emily's soft coos, the warmth of sunlight across our living room, the comforting hum of our home without Jonathan's presence, these became my anchor, reminding me of what was truly important. Revenge alone would not satisfy me if it did not also protect what I loved most. And so, between the late nights of meticulous research and the endless hours of care, I began to rebuild, not the life I had lost, but a life I would control entirely. By the time Jonathan's calls began, initially polite and then increasingly insistent, I was ready. I answered when I wished, ignored when I chose, and always with a quiet, knowing smile that unnerved him. He could not read me. He had left me believing he had broken me, and yet the silence that he feared was only growing louder, more potent, and more inevitable. The first part of the storm had passed. The betrayal had been executed, the wound opened, but healing and strategy had begun in its wake. And as I looked down at Emily, asleep and peaceful against my chest, I knew that the next steps would require patience, cunning, and the meticulous execution of plans born from years of underestimated strength. Jonathan Hale had made a fatal error. He had believed that possession and privilege equaled power. He had not counted on the quiet resilience of a woman who had nothing left to lose but everything to reclaim. In the days that followed, I walked through the house, examining every detail, every file, every contract. Small discoveries made me smile silently. Ownership documents misfiled, shares in the company subtly in my name. Minor legal loopholes he had arrogantly ignored. Each one was a drumbeat in the growing cadence of the storm. Jonathan would soon discover, as so many men have before, that underestimating a woman's resolve is always a mistake. And so, I waited. Not passively, but with intention. Not with fear, but with purpose. The storm had begun in my heart, but soon it would reach beyond it. Silence, I realized, was not absence. Silence was power. Silence was strategy. And Jonathan Hale, for all his confidence, had no idea the force he had unleashed. The first chapter of this story was over, but the real story, the one that would echo through every corner of our lives, was only beginning. I was Vanessa Morgan Hale, and I was ready. They say time heals all wounds, but I've learned time doesn't heal. It harvests. It gathers truth like storm clouds, and eventually, it pours. 3 months had passed since Jonathan handed me those papers in the hospital, and every day since, I woke with the same sting. The man who had vowed to protect me chose betrayal instead. Jonathan didn't waste a second before parading his new flame, Cassandra. He strutted through town with her on his arm as if I had never existed, as if the life we had built was a disposable stage prop. He paraded Cassandra like she was a trophy, but everyone knows trophies collect dust while legacies remain. Friends whispered, neighbors stared. The pitying glances stung more than I cared to admit. But while Jonathan thought my silence was weakness, I knew silence plants deeper seeds than anger ever could. Anger throws punches. Silence plants landmines. I poured myself into caring for my baby, Ethan. His tiny fingers wrapped around mine like anchors to a future Jonathan could never steal from me. At night, when exhaustion pressed heavy on my bones, I held Ethan close and whispered, "One day, son, they'll regret underestimating us." Jonathan seemed determined to make my life harder. He dragged me into court, demanding custody. Not out of love, but out of spite. He claimed I was unfit because I didn't have a flashy income, ignoring that I had nearly died bringing Ethan into this world. But courtrooms run on paper trails, and Jonathan had forgotten who handled most of the paperwork in our marriage. Every contract, every receipt, every transfer. My fingerprints were there. His arrogance blinded him, but I was quietly documenting everything, piece by piece, as carefully as a surgeon preparing for the decisive cut. Meanwhile, Cassandra played her role to perfection, the new queen in Jonathan's little kingdom. I saw the photos online, her sitting at the cafe I once designed menus for, her laughing with Jonathan at the same restaurants where I had celebrated his promotions. My name had been erased from the script, replaced with hers. But she was no queen, she was an actress, and Jonathan was her biggest fool. I didn't lash out. I didn't beg. I didn't try to expose them. Not yet. Because silence is thunder before the split. Instead, I worked quietly, rebuilding myself piece by piece. I started freelancing from home, small design projects at first, then larger ones. My bank account grew slowly but surely, like a sapling pushing through concrete. Each deposit wasn't just money. It was proof that Jonathan was wrong about me, proof that I didn't need his name or his wallet to survive. And then, one night, a storm broke in my chest. I was scrolling through social media when I saw Cassandra wearing a dress I had once bought for myself, posing inside the home Jonathan and I had shared. My home, Ethan's home. In the caption, she wrote, "Blessed to be building a new chapter with my love." My blood burned, not from jealousy, but from insult. That house wasn't Jonathan's to give, and Cassandra was flaunting what wasn't hers to keep. See, Jonathan had never cared for the fine print, but I had. Long before this nightmare began, Jonathan had convinced me to let him handle investments while I handled the boring legal stuff. He never read what he signed, too eager to show off the results without caring for the details. And in those details, hidden in the folds of contracts, deeds, and titles, was a truth Jonathan hadn't realized yet. The house, the cafe he ran, even certain accounts, they were under my name. I didn't plan it that way to trap him. Back then, I had trusted him completely. I had signed the paperwork to make things easier, never imagining it would one day become my secret weapon. Now, it was my thunder waiting for the sky to split open. Still, I stayed quiet. Cassandra could wear my dresses, sit on my couch, sip coffee in my kitchen, all while thinking she was the victor. Jonathan could keep strutting around like a peacock, blind to the axe hanging above him. Because storms don't announce themselves with whispers, they arrive with lightning. My lawyer, Ms. Reynolds, became my silent ally, calm, razor-sharp, and precise. She guided me through every clause and document like a general mapping out a battlefield. "Vanessa," she said one evening as we reviewed papers spread across her desk, "your husband thinks he's the puppet master, but legally, he's the puppet dangling by strings he can't see." I smiled for the first time in weeks. It wasn't a smile of joy, but of recognition. The recognition that I had been underestimated for too long. Jonathan thought I was still that quiet, obedient wife who would bow to his demands. Cassandra thought she was stepping into a ready-made empire, with me erased from the picture. But they were both living in an illusion. I was patient, I was methodical, and with every day that passed, I grew stronger, financially, emotionally, strategically. The world saw a betrayed woman left in the dust. But behind closed doors, I was thunder gathering strength, biding its time. Because when the storm finally came, it wouldn't just be rain, it would be a flood, and neither Jonathan nor Cassandra would be able to swim. They say arrogance blinds, and Jonathan wore his like a crown. By the time Ethan turned 6 months old, Jonathan and Cassandra were acting as though they owned the world. And me. Invitations were sent across town. Jonathan was expanding his cafe into a luxury restaurant, and Cassandra would be hosting the grand opening by his side. Their smiling faces were plastered on flyers, Cassandra beaming like the queen of a kingdom she didn't build. To outsiders, it looked like triumph. To me, it looked like opportunity. Because every brick of that cafe, every table and chair, every espresso machine humming in the back, belonged to me. My name was etched into the deed like thunder carved into the sky. Jonathan just hadn't bothered to look. The night of the opening, I dressed in quiet elegance, a simple black dress, heels that clicked like a metronome of war, and a calmness that bordered on deadly. Ms. Reynolds walked beside me, a leather folder tucked under her arm like a sword waiting to be unsheathed. When I arrived, heads turned. Some whispered, some gasped. Cassandra stiffened the moment she saw me step through the glass doors. Jonathan's smirk faltered for the first time all evening. "Vanessa," he said through clenched teeth, masking his unease with charm, "you weren't invited." I tilted my head, offering him a smile that wasn't a smile at all. "Jonathan, darling, I don't need an invitation to walk into my own property." Confusion flickered across his face, then annoyance. Cassandra scoffed loudly, clutching his arm. "This is pathetic. She's desperate for attention." Ms. Reynolds stepped forward, unfolding the papers with surgical precision. "Actually," she said coolly, her voice slicing through the chatter, "she's here to remind you that this cafe is legally hers. Every asset, every fixture, every square inch is under Vanessa Hale's ownership. You've been playing king in a castle you don't even own." The room fell silent. Whispers rippled through the crowd like cracks in ice. Jonathan's face drained of color. Cassandra's hand slipped from his arm. "That's absurd," Jonathan barked. "I built this place. Everyone knows that." "Built, perhaps?" I replied, my voice steady as steel. "But signed? That was me. You handed me the pen years ago, Jonathan, when you couldn't be bothered to read the fine print. I was the quiet one, remember? The one who handled the boring details. And now those details are thunder." Ms. Reynolds placed the documents on a nearby table, her finger tapping the line where my name was printed in bold, undeniable ink. "You've been trespassing in your own fantasy," I continued, "and the lease ends tonight." The silence broke like glass. Gasps, murmurs, a few stifled laughs. The mighty Jonathan Hale, undone not by scandal, not by rumor, but by paperwork he never bothered to read. Jonathan stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of his own downfall. You wouldn't. Vanessa, we have a son together." I looked him dead in the eye. "Exactly. And that son deserves to know his mother isn't weak. You handed me divorce papers in a hospital bed while I held the child I nearly died for. That was the day you lost the right to beg for mercy." Cassandra's mask of confidence shattered. "You tricked him!" she hissed. "No," I said softly, almost pitying her. "He tricked himself. You both did. You thought silence meant surrender, when all along it was strategy." The room buzzed with tension, every eye fixed on us. And then, with deliberate calm, I added the final strike. "As of this moment, Jonathan, you're not just unemployed. You're also homeless. Because the house you've been playing house in with Cassandra, that's mine too." Gasps erupted like thunderclaps. Jonathan staggered back as if struck. Cassandra's eyes widened, panic flashing as the walls of her borrowed kingdom collapsed around her. I didn't need to scream, I didn't need to gloat. The documents, the truth, and their own arrogance did the work for me. Jonathan sank into a chair, pale and trembling. Cassandra slipped away into the crowd, her exit as quiet as her rise had been loud. I turned to Ms. Reynolds. "Have the locks changed by tomorrow morning." She nodded. And just like that, the storm broke. Later that night, I stood in Ethan's nursery, watching him sleep. His chest rose and fell in soft rhythm. His tiny hands curled into fists. I brushed a kiss across his forehead, whispering, "We're safe now. Mama kept her promise." The storm had passed, but not without reshaping the world around us. Jonathan was left adrift, a man who mistook silence for weakness and discovered too late that silence was power sharpened to a blade. Cassandra faded into the background, another footnote in his ruin. As for me, I didn't just survive. I inherited the empire they thought they owned. I stood taller, stronger, no longer the quiet wife in the shadows, but the storm itself. Because here's the truth no one tells you. Silence isn't surrender. Silence is strategy. Silence is the thunder waiting for the sky to split open. And when it finally does, no one forgets the sound.